Hello. If we've not met yet, my name is Michael. I'm the worship pastor here at Crossroads, and I am so excited to get to dive into the book of James with you today. You know, my college journey was a little convoluted. I started out in community college, and then I transferred to a school out on the East Coast. Then I took a gap year. Then I went back to community college, and then I finally transferred to the school that I would eventually graduate from. And, you know, I was getting a little discouraged with college because what should have taken me 4 years ended up taking me closer to 6. And I was getting very discouraged. I was ready to start my life. I had a beautiful girl who had agreed to marry me, and I knew that I couldn't support her while I was still in school, but I couldn't get a job without my degree. And so I was just in this state of confusion and discouragement, and I just didn't know what to do. Well, I had just heard a sermon about James chapter 1, talking about asking God for wisdom. And so I knew that wisdom was what I needed in that moment. And so I went to the Lord in prayer to ask for just that. Now, I was a baby Christian at the time, so my faith was through the roof. I just couldn't believe that God would be willing to give us that sort of wisdom. And life and doubt hadn't quite crept in and clouded my understanding of the scriptures. And so I took James at his promise and asked the Lord for wisdom. Well, turns out I had front-loaded my degree plan with all of my classes for my minor so that I could focus on my major at the end of the degree. Well, I had actually taken too many classes for my minor, and my academic advisor told me that if I swapped the two, I could cut a year off of my degree plan, as long as I took a pretty heavy course load. I tell you that story not as a fun anecdote of my college years, but really just to emphasize the truth of what James was saying, that we can ask God for wisdom in faith, and he is going to give it to us. James 1:5-8 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." How many of you lack wisdom? Now, don't raise your hands or anything. I'm not trying to front you out. But I think if we were honest with ourselves, whether it's in our marriages, how we parent, in our jobs, how to handle our finances, all of us need some help in some way when it comes to wisdom. You know, and all we have to do is ask. That's the beauty of what God has given. But there's only one caveat to that, is that we have to ask in faith. To ask without faith or with doubting, James tells us that we are like a double-minded man. Now, that phrase double-minded always makes me think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? You've got one, Dr. Jekyll, who is intelligent and creative, and then you've got Mr. Hyde, who's just an absolute monster. The same man, but two very, very different minds. And that's what happens when we begin to doubt God. I mean, God is incredible. We know what he can do, right? We have a whole Bible full of stories of his mighty deeds. In fact, you and I have seen God's hand in our own lives. And we look at the difficulties in front of us and we think, God can't do that. And how silly it sounds when we actually say it out loud, right? But the fact remains that when we begin to doubt God, we begin to become what James calls being unstable in all our ways. Doubt is the antithesis of faith. And I don't just mean it's the opposite, but it's literally its nemesis. Faith is not just belief, but belief in action. And when doubt starts to creep in, it doesn't just affect the way we think about things, but it affects the way that we act. James tells us straight out that whatever we believe God will do, he will do. If we ask the Lord in faith, he is going to respond to that faith. If we ask the Lord in doubt, he isn't going to respond. So whether you believe he will or believe he won't, you're right. Faith is not a governing of God's power. Just because we have a lot of faith or a little faith doesn't change God's ability to interact in our circumstances. Our faith is not what causes God's power to flow, but it lets God know that we are ready for his power to flow. God is not some magical Mr. Fix-It. He's not our genie in a bottle. But his word very clearly tells us, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. You see, wisdom is kind of a funny thing if we think about it. Intelligence and wisdom are different. Intelligence is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. And so when we ask God for his wisdom, it's a way for us to ask him, how should we live our lives according to his will and his word? Because that's really what we're after. We're after God's will for our lives. And when we receive godly wisdom, that will becomes very evident in our lives and very easy to follow. So remember, ask the Lord and he will give that wisdom to you. Faith is an incredibly powerful tool, but doubt is its greatest enemy. Plant your feet on the rock of Christ Jesus and believe that he is who he says he is and that he will do what he says he will do. Let's just spend some time reflecting on all the times in our lives when maybe doubt has crept in and been one of our greatest enemies. But also take some time to think about times when faith has abounded in our lives. Or maybe even think about times when God has imbued you with the wisdom necessary in order to follow his will for your life. And let's keep all of this at the forefront of our minds as we continue our study in the book of James.